History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 8, The Latest Age. Chapter 3, Crumbling Certainties. The Illusion of Convergence. Legislation was not really important until after 1961, after the inauguration of a successful campaign of sit ins by black leaders, which itself achieved many important local victories. Kennedy initiated a program going beyond the securing of voting rights to attack segregation and inequality of many kinds. It was to be continued by his successor. Poverty, poor housing, and bad schools in run-down urban areas were symptoms of deep dislocations inside American society, and inequalities were made more irksome by some increasing affluence in which they were set. The Kennedy administration appealed to the Americans to see their removal as one of the challenges of a new frontier. Even greater emphasis was given to legislation to remove them by Lyndon Johnson, who succeeded to the presidency when Kennedy was murdered in November 1963. Unhappily, the deepest roots of the American black problem appeared to lie beyond the reach of law in what came to be called the ghetto areas of great American cities. Again, a long perspective is helpful. In 1965, 100 years after emancipation from slavery became law throughout the whole United States, a ferocious outbreak of rioting in a black district of Los Angeles was estimated to have involved at its height as many as 75,000 people. Other troubles followed in other cities, but not on the same scale. 25 years later, all that had happened in Watts, where the Los Angeles outbreak took place, was that conditions had further deteriorated. The problem of America's blacks was, it was usually agreed, one of economic opportunity, but none the easier to solve for that. It not only remained unsolved but also appeared to be running away from the solution. The poisons it secreted burst forth in crime. A major collapse in health standards in some black communities and in ungovernable and virtually unpoliceable inner city areas. In the culture and politics of white America, they seemed at times to have produced a near neurotic obsession with color and racial issues. His own poor Southern background had made President Johnson a convinced and convincing exponent of the great society in which he discerned America's future. And perhaps this might have held promise for the handling of the black economic problem had he survived. Potentially one of America's great reforming presidents, Johnson nevertheless experienced tragic failure for all his aspirations, experience, and skill. His constructive and reforming work was soon forgotten, and it must be set aside when his presidency came to be overshadowed by an Asian war disastrous enough before it ended to be called by some America's Sicilian expedition. Vietnam. American policy in Southeast Asia under Eisenhower had come to rest on the dogma that non communist South Vietnam was essential to security and that it had to be kept in the Western camp if others in the area, or perhaps as far away as India and Australia, were not to be subverted. So the United States had become the backer of a conservative government in part of Indochina. President Kennedy did not question this view and began to back up American military aid with advisors. At his death, there were 23,000 of them in South Vietnam, and in fact, many of them were in action in the field. President Johnson followed the course already set, believing that pledges to other countries had to be shown to be sound currency. But government after government in Saigon turned out to be broken reeds. At the beginning of 1965, Johnson was advised that South Vietnam might collapse. He had the authority to act, given him thanks to careful political management by Congress after North Vietnamese attacks on American ships the previous year. And air attacks were launched against targets in North Vietnam. Soon afterwards, the first official American combat units were sent to the South. American participation quickly soared out of control. In 1968, there were over 500,000 American servicemen in Vietnam. By Christmas that year, a heavier tonnage of bombs had been dropped on North Vietnam than had fallen on Germany and Japan together in the entire Second World War. The outcome was politically disastrous. It was almost the least of Johnson's worries that the American balance of payments was wrecked by the war's huge cost, which also took money from badly needed reform projects at home. Worse was the bitter domestic uproar that arose as casualties mounted and attempts to negotiate seemed to get nowhere. The better off young, among them a future president, sought to avoid conscription, and Americans gloomily contemplated at home on their television screens the cost of a struggle viewable in their homes as no other war had ever been. Rancor grew, and with it, the alarm of moderate America. It was small consolation that Russia's costs in supplying arms to North Vietnam were heavy too. More was involved in domestic strife over Vietnam than the agitation of young people rioting in protest and distrust of their government, or the idealism of conservatives outraged by ritual desecrations of the symbols of patriotism and refusals to carry out military service. Vietnam was changing the way many Americans looked at the outside world. In Southeast Asia, it was at last borne in on the thoughtful among them that even the United States could not obtain every result it wanted, far less obtain it at any reasonable cost. The late 1960s brought the end of the illusion that American power was limitless and irresistible. Americans had approached the post war world with this illusion intact. Their country's strength, they believed, had, after all, decided two world wars. Beyond them, there stretched back a century and a half of virtually unchecked and unhindered continental expansion of immunity from European intervention, of the growth of an impressive hegemony in the American hemisphere. There was nothing in American history that was wholly disastrous or irredeemable. Hardly anything in which there was ultimately failure, and nothing over which most Americans felt any guilt. It had been easy and natural for that background to breed a careless assumption of limitless possibility. Prosperity helped to carry it over from domestic to foreign concerns. Americans easily overlooked the special conditions on which their success story had long been built. The reckoning had begun to be drawn up in the 1950s when many Americans had to be content with a lesser victory in Korea than they had hoped for. There had then opened 20 years of frustrating dealings with nations, often enjoying not a tenth of the power of United States, but apparently able to thwart her. At last, in the Vietnam disaster, both the limits of power and its full costs were revealed. In March 1968, the strength of the rising opposition to the war was shown clearly in the primary elections. Johnson was already moving towards the conclusion that the United States could not win. He was ready to restrict bombing and ask the North Vietnamese to open negotiations again. Dramatically, he now announced that he would not stand for re election in 1968. Just as the casualties of the Korean War won Eisenhower election in 1952, so the casualties of Vietnam on the battlefield and at home helped with the presence of a third candidate to elect another Republican president in 1968. only 4 years after Johnson won a huge Democratic majority, and to re elect him in 1972. Vietnam was not the only factor, but it was one of the most important in finally dislocating the old Democratic coalition. The new president, Richard Nixon, began to withdraw American ground forces from Vietnam soon after his inauguration, but peacemaking took 3 years. In 1970, secret negotiations between North Vietnam and the United States started. There were further withdrawals, but also renewed and intensified bombing of the North and its extension to Cambodia by the Americans. The diplomacy was tortuous and difficult. The United States could not admit it was abandoning its ally, though in fact it had to do so, nor would the North Vietnamese accept terms that did not leave them able to harass the southern regime through their sympathizers in the south. Amid considerable public outcry in the United States, bombing was briefly resumed at the end of 1972, but for the last time. Soon afterwards, on 27th January 1973, a ceasefire was signed in Paris. The war had cost the United States vast sums of money and 58,000 dead. It had gravely damaged American prestige, eroded American diplomatic influence, and ravaged domestic politics and had frustrated reform. What had been achieved was a temporary preservation of a shaky South Vietnam, saddled with internal problems which made its survival unlikely, while terrible destruction had been inflicted on the peoples of Indochina, of whom 3 million died. Perhaps the abandonment of the illusion of American omnipotence went some way to offset these costs. It was a real success to have disentangled the United States from the morass, and President Nixon reaped the political benefit. The liquidation of the venture had followed other signs of his recognition of how much the world had already changed since the Cuban crisis. The most striking of these was a new policy of normal and direct American diplomatic relations with Communist China. It came to a climax only in 1978, but two dramatic earlier events had preceded even the making of the Vietnam peace. In October 1971, the UN General Assembly had recognized the People's Republic as the only legitimate representative of China in the United Nations and expelled the representative of Taiwan. This was not an outcome the United States had anticipated until the crucial vote was taken. The following February, there took place a visit by Nixon to China. That was the first visit ever made by an American president to the mainland Asia, and one he described as an attempt to bridge 16,000 miles and 22 years of hostility. When Nixon followed his Chinese trip by becoming also the first American president to visit Moscow in May 1972, and this was followed by an interim agreement on arms limitation, the first of its kind. It seemed that another important change had come about. The stark, polarized simplicities of the Cold War were blurring, however doubtful the future might be. The Vietnam settlement followed, and this can hardly have been unrelated to it. Moscow and Peking both had to be squared if there was to be a ceasefire. China's attitude to the Vietnamese struggle was, we may guess, by no means simple. It was complicated by potential danger from the USSR, by the United States' use of its power elsewhere in Asia, notably in Taiwan and Japan, and by older memories of the strength of Vietnamese nationalism. Its Indo-Chinese communist satellite could not be trusted. Once seen by China as one of her tributary peoples, the Vietnamese looked back on a long history of struggle against Chinese as well as French imperialism. In the immediate aftermath of the American withdrawal, too, The nature of the struggle going on in Vietnam was more and more clearly revealed as a civil war over who should rule a reunited country. The North Vietnamese did not wait long to settle the matter. For a time, the United States government had to pretend not to see this. There was too much relief at home over the liquidation of the Asian commitment for scruples to be expressed over the actual observation of the peace terms that had made withdrawal possible. When a political scandal forced Nixon's resignation in 1974, his successor faced a Congress suspicious of what it saw as dangerous foreign adventures and determined to thwart them. There would be no attempt to uphold the peace terms of the 1972 insofar as they guaranteed the South Vietnamese regime against overthrow. Early in 1975, American aid to Saigon came to an end. A government which had lost virtually all its other territory was reduced to a backs to the wall attempt to hold the capital city and lower Mekong with a demoralized and defeated army. At the same time, communist forces in Cambodia were destroying another regime once supported by the United States. Congress prevented the sending of further military and financial help. The pattern of China in 1947 was being repeated. The United States was cutting her losses at the expense of those who had relied on her. Though 117,000 Vietnamese left with the Americans, and the North Vietnamese army entered Saigon in April 1975. Such an outcome was doubly ironic. In the first place, it seemed to show that the hardliners on Asian policy had been right all along, that only the knowledge that the United States was in the last resort prepared to fight for them could guarantee the post-colonial regime's resistance to communism. Secondly, the swing back to the isolationism in the United States was accentuated, not muffled by defeat and disaster. Those who reflected on the American dead and missing and the huge cost now saw the whole Indochina episode as a pointless and unjustifiable waste on behalf of the peoples who would not fight to defend themselves. It was arguable, though, that better relations with China mattered much more than the loss of Vietnam. As the 1980 drew nearer, many Americans were confused and worried. National morale was not good. Vietnam has left deep psychic wounds as well as helping to feed a counterculture at home, which they found frightening. In the 1960s, the first voices of note had raised the alarm over environmental dangers. The 1970s had brought the oil crisis and a new sense of exposure at a moment when, for the first time, America's Middle Eastern ally, Israel, no longer seemed invulnerable to her enemies. The disgrace and near impeachment of President Nixon after a scandalous abuse of executive power had eaten away the confidence in the nation's institutions. Abroad, the behavior of other allies, themselves worried and confused by American disarray, seemed less predictable than in the past. For the first time, too, Americans' confidence in the promise their nation had always been believed to hold out for mankind faltered in the face of what looked like blunt rejection by much of the Islamic world. The situation was indeed not easy to read. Yet the American democratic system showed no sign of breaking down, nor of not meeting many of the country's needs, even if it could not find answers to all its problems. The economy had astonishingly been able to continue for years to pay for a hugely expensive war, a space exploration program that put men on the moon, and for garrisons around the world. True, the black Americans' plight continued to worsen, and some of the country's greatest cities seemed stricken by urban decay. Fewer Americans, though, seemed to find such facts as worrying as their country's supposed inferiority in missile strength to the Soviet Union. It was to be an issue in presidential election of 1980. President Gerald Ford, who had taken office in 1974 on the resignation of his predecessor, had already had to face a Congress unwilling to countenance further aid to its allies in Indochina. When Cambodia collapsed and South Vietnam quickly followed, questions began to be asked at home and abroad about how far what looked like a worldwide retreat of American power might go. If the United States would no longer fight over Indochina, would she then do so over Thailand? More alarmingly still, would she fight over Israel or even Berlin? There were good reasons to think that Americans' mood of resignation and dismay would not last forever, but while it lasted, their allies looked about them and felt uneasy. Two Europes. Europe was the birthplace of Cold War and was for a long time its main theater. Yet, well before 1970, there had been signs that the terrible simplifications institutionalized in NATO and even more rigidly in Warsaw Pact might not be all that was shaping history there. Although long insulated by Soviet power from external stimuli to change and by its command economies, there were signs of division in Eastern Europe. The violence with which Albania, the tiniest of them, condemned the Soviet Union and applauded China when the two fell out in the 1960s had to be endured by the Russians. Albania had no frontier with other Warsaw Pact countries and so was not likely to have to take account of the Red Army. It was more striking when Romania, with Chinese support, successfully contested the direction of its economy by Comecon, asserting a national right to develop in its own interest. It took up a vaguely neutralist position on questions of foreign policy, though remaining inside the Warsaw Pact, and did so, oddly enough, under a ruler who imposed on his countrymen one of the most rigidly dictatorial regimes in Eastern Europe. But Romania had no land frontier with the NATO country and one 800 kilometers long with Russia. Her kittishness could be tolerated, therefore, because it could be quickly curbed if necessary. That there were clear limits to the dislocation of the old monolithic unity of communism was clearly enough shown in 1968 when a communist government in Czechoslovakia set about liberalizing its internal structure and developing trade relations with West Germany. This was not to be tolerated. After a series of attempts to bring her to heel, Czechoslovakia was invaded in August 1968 by Warsaw Pact forces. To avoid a repetition of what had happened in Hungary in 1956, the Czech government did not resist, and a brief attempt to provide an example of socialism with a human face, as a Czech politician had put it, was obliterated. Nonetheless, Sino-Soviet tension combined with tremblings within the Eastern Bloc and perhaps the uneasiness of the United States over relations with Latin American countries lead to suggestions that the world as a whole was abandoning bipolarity for polycentricism, as an Italian communist called it. The loosening of Cold War simplicities had indeed been surprising. Other complicating developments had meanwhile emerged in Western Europe. By 1980, it was clear that one of the historic roles of its people was over, since they had by then ruled no more of the world's surface than their ancestors had done 500 years earlier. Huge transformations had taken place and irreversible things had been done then. Although Europe's imperial past was over, the discovery of a new role was well underway. Western Europe had begun to show some of the first feeble signs that nationalism's grip on the human potential for large-scale organization might be loosening in the very place where nationalism had been born. Legacies of common European experience have been traced by enthusiasts back to the Carolingians, but 1945 will do as a starting point. From that date, the continent's future for more than 40 years was mainly determined by the outcome of the war and Soviet policy. The likelihood of another great civil war in the West over the German question seemed remote, since defeat and partition had disposed of the German problem and so quietened the fears of France. Soviet policy had then given the Western countries many new reasons to cooperate more closely. The events in Eastern Europe in the late 1940s struck them as a warning of what might happen if the Americans ever went home, and they remained divided. The Marshall Plan and NATO turned out to have been the first two of many important steps towards the integration of a new Europe. The integration had more than one source. The initiation of the Marshall Plan was followed by the setting up of an organization, at first of 16 countries but later expanded, of European Economic Cooperation in 1948. But the following year, a month after the signing of the treaty setting up NATO, the first political bodies representing 10 different European states were also set up under a new Council of Europe. The economic forces making for integration were developing more rapidly. However, customs unions had already been created in 1948 between the Benelux countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and in a different form between France and Italy. Finally, the most important of the early steps towards greater integration emerged from a French proposal for a coal and steel community. This came into existence formally in 1952 and embraced France, Italy, and Benelux countries, and most significantly, West Germany. Possible the rejuvenation of the industrial heartland of Western Europe and was the main step towards the integration of Western Germany into a new international structure. Through economic rearrangement, there came into existence the means of containing while reviving West Germany, whose strength, it was becoming clear, was needed in a Western Europe menaced by Soviet land power. Under the influence of events in Korea, American official opinion, to the consternation of some Europeans, was in the early 1950s rapidly coming around to the view that Germany had to be rearmed. Other facts too helped to ease the way to supranational organization in Europe. The political weakness symptomized by their domestic communist parties subsided in both France and Italy, mainly thanks to economic recovery. Communists had ceased to play any part in their governments as early as in 1947, and the danger that France and Italian democracy might suffer a fate like Czechoslovakia's had disappeared by 1950. Anti-communist opinion tended to coalesce about parties whose integrating forces were either Roman Catholic politicians or Social Democrats, well aware of the fate of their comrades in Eastern Europe. Broadly speaking, these changes meant that Western European governments of a moderate right-wing complexion pursued similar aims of economic recovery, welfare service provision, and Western European integration in practical matters during the 1950s.